Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the session today. Today, we're going to be talking about diversifying narratives on a global stage, and I'm joined by two amazing creatives, Mateo Kries and Gunjan Gupta. I'd like to start the session by setting a bit of context to what we are going to be talking about today. When we talk about design today, we see that it isn't confined by any geographies or ideas or materials per se, but in fact, practices are moving across continents at an unprecedented speed and resolve. But I think the framework through which we understand design and interpret design in terms of who's framing it, who's contextualizing it, and who's validating it is something that's still evolving. And, globally, I think different design cultures have always existed, but today the real question lies in how designers, institutions, and audiences are sort of redefining the conversation and taking it to the next level where, we don't just stop at how, this shift is moving across continents and how we're not just talking about inclusivity when it comes to design, but actually talking about that, what are the factors that are contributing to it and moving beyond it at some point. And I'd like to begin by talking a bit about the history of it all. And my first question is actually to both of you. We know that the design discourse in the 20th century was largely framed by global economies. Like, for example, it rested mostly in Europe and North America. And my question to you is that, would you like to briefly tell us that what, according to you, would have been the structural conditions that allowed centers like Europe and North America to be the authorities at the time?
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing me over from Europe to this amazing event, to the fair. I'm really happy to contribute something to this discourse around this event. I've had 2 very rich days in Delhi now in the warm hands of people like you, Misha and Vasundhara and Gunjan Gupta, Surab Gupta, many people who really welcomed me a lot, and I will certainly come back. This I know already. To your question, of course, as a design museum, we act in a certain historical framework that it has not been created by us, but that we have found. Our museum is a relatively young institution. It was founded in the late 1980s, when there was still, I would say, a prevailing paradigm of what design is that had been created 100, 150 years before, in the 19th century, when industrialization came about, when the idea of something like design emerged as a kind of counter idea to traditional crafts production. There were emerging industries that produced any type of object that were very decorated. So people felt there was a lack of orientation. So the initial idea of design was to give orientation, to say what's right and what's wrong. So it was a very pedagogical and somehow also, I would say, authoritative idea of what design was, which is understandable when you look at that specific context of the 19th and early 20th century. Now, when we started our museum, it was a different time. It was a time where designers of a postmodern era already protested against this modernist ideology of knowing what good design is. So again, there was a different context. And I feel that, now our museum is about 35 years old. We're yet in a different context, which is no longer this postmodern context, which was still very Western, I have to say. And we've seen that in the last 10 to 20 years, things have shifted so much that how we exhibit design today is totally different from how we exhibited design in the Vitra Design Museum 20 years ago. It's much more contextual. We try to be more diverse. Well, I think we'll have occasion to talk about this more in detail, but this is this little outline of the context that I see us acting in, and to which we have to find the right answers to, which makes the work in a design museum extremely interesting and challenging at the moment, at this specific moment that we're in.
And important as well.
I'll start by saying thank you. Thank you to ID, Misha. It's an honor to be on this panel with Mateo. I think what we're talking about today is an extremely important topic, especially in the current times, in the context of design and Indian design particularly. I would say 20th century design authority was built on industrial power and consolidation, institutional consolidation, the manufacturing capacity, formal structures of design schools, museums, publications, and global trade networks largely dominated by Europe and Northern America. But that authority was also inextricably linked to colonial frameworks and infrastructures, which determined systems of extraction, classification, and circulation, and determined what counted as design and who was recognized as an author. And that's sort of where we are today in India when we talk about design. Much of the global south, which has been very much in discussion today, was never absent from the story. It was just positioned differently. Material knowledge traveled outward, but intellectual authorship remained more centralized. And practices such as India, which were sort of rooted in decentralized craft economies, informal production systems, and embodied knowledge, did not align with the modern metrics of industrial scale. As a result, they were often categorized as craft, heritage, or anthropology, rather than as design innovation. I would say Indian craft production, which was highly coveted in from the 16th to the 19th century, saw a very sharp decline post the Second World War, when the metrics of sort of industrial production and standardization became the values against which it was determined. So this has been the context that of 20th century design, as I understand it, as a Indian craft design practitioner in India. I think India sits within that broader condition. Its design intelligence was not, I would say, less sophisticated, but it wasn't really sort of considered in that sense. So as global narratives diversify today, the opportunity is not merely about India being a part of it or the global south being part of it, but probably to the criteria is what we're talking about, and its, expansion.
And like I was saying earlier, that institutions like Vitra Museum, I think they play a great role and a very important one. And I want to understand from you, Mateo, that what do you think is changing at an institutional level? We've seen that Vitra has really expanded its program with the global exchange and the kind of research, and they're really broadening the horizon now. What do you think, how do you describe the current programming of the museum, and what feels different today compared to, decades earlier?
Well, first of all, we have to differentiate between our different activities. As a museum, there's 3 pillars of what we do. We do exhibitions, we collect, and we do educational activities. These are the main pillars on which our museum and any design museum rests. So in collecting, for example, we're trying to make the collection more diverse and reflect these new evolutions that I and Gunjan just talked about. Collections of museums are usually built over decades, sometimes over centuries. So if you want to really redirect the collection, it needs a long time, really. You don't do this in 1 or in 5 or even in 10 years. We have a relatively small collection compared to, let's say, the V&A's collection. We have about 10,000 pieces of furniture and 2,000 lamps, which, if you knew know the really large design museums collections is relatively few. I think the exceptional quality of our collection lies in its quality, the quality of the pieces. But again, 10,000 objects, if we have, let's say, a Western and male dominance in that body of objects, you can imagine how many objects we need to acquire in the next years to really make a tiny percentile change. But we are decided to do this. And so we're working on finding designers' works, relevant works that can enter our collection that make a change. And we're not only collecting them, but we're communicating about what we collect, to explain why we collect this and why we want this to make a change. So we brought in some of Gunjan's objects that we just saw on the photos in the collection. Excuse me. I'm also here to look around to see if I find other objects that we might take into the collection. So I'm constantly scouting and looking at what could potentially change this canon of design that is a collection. I mean, it might sound a bit pretentious if I'm saying this as the director of that museum, but I think this is the case. You know, it's the case that what museums do is defining what might be relevant to keep for future generations, and that comes with a big responsibility. That comes with publication projects like the Atlas of Furniture Design, on which we worked for about 15 years with 80 different authors from all around the world. It was a massive publication project where we want to use the collection as a source of reference for what are the big guiding lines that we can recognize in design history. So that's what we do on the level of collecting. We want to represent a larger variety of countries and cultures in the collection. We also want to represent more women against the male dominance in design history. And that's not only changing what we're collecting today from today's design world, but it's interestingly also changing our look back into design history, because when we look back on the last 100 years, in fact, a lot of really interesting positions and works and protagonists, female protagonists, have been overseen. It's not that they haven't been there. They just haven't been on the radar. Maybe because they have created lesser works, because maybe their biographies, their careers have been interrupted by getting a child, changing the profession. So maybe the creative biography of a woman is a bit different than from the man. But it still has produced so many relevant works that we just need to change our perspective. And maybe it's a bit more work to do, a bit more research. But there are these works, and we've started this process about 15 years ago to really look at design history again, but with a different lens. And suddenly you say, okay, these works have been there. We just need to collect them, and it's a bit more difficult to find them, but they are there. In terms of exhibitions, it's a different thing. We do several major exhibitions every year, so we have diversified the range of people that we do exhibitions about. We've done an exhibition about Balkrishna Doshi in 2018. Now there's an exhibition about Geoffrey Bawa coming up. There will certainly be other personalities from countries that haven't been on our radar for solo exhibitions that will come up. The thematic shows have become more layered, more diverse as well. We're looking at topics that give a more critical understanding of what design can be. You know, as I said in the beginning, 30 years ago, our exhibitions and most of the design exhibitions were mainly beautiful objects on podiums. Today, a design exhibition is a much more complex and narrative and critical thing. There's media, there's contextual background, there's process material, there's a lot of critical contextualization, and that makes design exhibitions so much more interesting, also more challenging. We need different curatorial skills for this. But the way how curating design exhibitions is working today is reflecting what you just described. So we try to react to this and do our job as a design museum, and that's why I'm here also.
I'd like to ask you another question taking from what you just said. You said that you're always on the lookout, and of course there is a process with which you are changing things, as you go. Is there a certain process or a criteria that when you're collecting, you said you're adding new geographies, new spaces where you're looking out for designers. How do you do that?
It's a very good question. We have an acquisition group. I wouldn't call it committee because it's not very formalized. It's our chief curator, it's our head of collections and myself. And then we have our museum's founder, Rolf Fehlbaum. And we have a group of 4, and everyone proposes objects. We discuss, should we take in this object in the collection? And we discuss about criteria. So certain criteria are linked to innovation. Now, innovation is a term you could discuss for a long time. But for us, it says that an object should add something new to the design world, either on a material level, on a technical level, on a formal level, or even on an artistic or a conceptual level. So the presence of innovation can be in very different ways. So we're not using the term innovation in this very narrow technological or even economical sense. This being said, this sounds very easy, but it's very complicated, because we have to realize in these discussions that what we consider as relevant to take in a collection might be different from what has been collected 20 years ago, as I said. And also the aesthetical criteria might be, it's very different to talk about this, because we have all been educated and raised with a certain set of criteria, but also with a certain visual culture that has trained our eye of what we recognize as relevant and where our eye rests and says, oh, this is interesting, let's give a second look. And I've been seeing in the last 15 years that really I have to unlearn and relearn to see things that are relevant. And I'm struggling for words, because it's not only an intellectual process, it's really also a process of being open to unlearn and revisit things that you have considered as granted. Also there's very strong dogmas that I, as a design historian, when I was trained at university 25 years ago, I've learned this, what's good design? Form follows function, functionality, what is functionality, etc. And this is deep in my system of perception. And it's so rewarding that this is now being challenged. And I have the opportunity to learn that things can be very different from this, what I learned at university a few decades ago. But it's, as you see, I'm struggling still to explain it, because we have very, very heated discussions about single objects, where some of the curators, or even our museum founder, who is 2 generations older than I am, says, oh no, come on, we cannot, this is not part of what our collection stands for. I'm not going into details now, but then we discuss and we say, no, listen, it's a different way of looking at design, but it has a relevance because of this or this or this reason. So we're really taking this responsibility of having a relevant collection very seriously and try to take the right decisions. I'm not sure if we always take the right decisions, but we have really enriched our cosmos of what can be in a collection, and that's a great time to work in this museum at the moment.
No, amazing. I think it's very encouraging to know that these kind of efforts are happening. I'm going to move on to you, Gunjan, and talk a little bit about the Indian context, that where India stands in the whole scheme of thing at the moment. And if you look at the present moment, where do you think Indian design stands globally? And I'm talking not from a very heritage and craft point of view, but more about the contemporary practice of design.
I was very sort of delighted to hear your comment about how it's so rewarding for you to be being so open as a museum and as a design historian to different perspectives, and that is obviously very good news for the way we've been doing things in India. I think Indian design is at a very interesting place. Of course, the issue with with us as a design ecosystem is no longer about visibility. We are at international platforms, which we were not part of, say, maybe 7, 8 years ago. Visibility is very much part of who we are today. We've established ourselves as quality producers, second to none, perfected all of those narratives which Made in India did not really stand for many years. I mean, it was a cheap and cheerful sort of, craft economy that design and was integrated within. So those have been amazing leaps. I think there is an opportunity at the moment for Indian design to think deeper of how meaning and making can come together. Because I think when we're talking about sort of design history and we're talking about perspectives, we're also talking about what is at the core of design? How do Indians live? What does it mean to live with objects? And I think one of the sort of most telling aspects of who we are as a culture is that chairs only came to our culture 400 years ago. It came with the colonial rule in the 16th century, prior to which we were essentially a floor-based society. And elevation of furniture was primarily for nobility or the kings, etc. So how does a floor-based society, which has sat without, in the absence of any furniture, really sort of find its voice or, narrative within that space? And I think it is what I discovered. I mean, I literally, when I was a student, I would look at Mateo's books and I would look at the Vitra Design Archive and those miniatures, and I'd be like, wow, I mean, I want to design a chair and I want to understand what is contained within that chair. Is it something that's craft? Is it beauty? But I think when I delved deeper, I realized India never had chairs. So I had to start with the concept of the non-chair. For a yoga-based society, which, we were spiritually and mind, body, and soul alignment. That gave me this understanding and made me think about design intelligence contained on, the streets of India, of how we live, and the adaptive logic of necessity-based invention, which is known as jugaad. And I think it is bringing these perspectives into design, knowledge, combination of high and low, which is very, rooted in design culture. So I would definitely like to see a lot more of, deeper dialogues around how people in India live, the timelessness of certain objects in our culture, like a matka or a kullar or a gadda or a bori. These have been there for the past 2,000 years and continue to be there. And, although India is modernizing at breakneck speed, I do foresee in the next 100, 200 years, these objects will be very much integrated within, all the things that we live with. So there is that, sacred intelligence, timelessness, and I think India and Indian design on a global platform has an opportunity to speak about the sort of deeper elements of what drives our craft, our understanding of life.
Exactly. And if you talk about the designer's position in the global system right now, do you think we're living in a time where the designers carry more responsibility now to contextualize their work, to sort of represent the culture right in the global scenario, and to position themselves sort of critically when they're representing the culture?
I think designers are, we represent culture for sure, but we're representing an evolving and a dynamic culture. So I think it's more important for us to find ways of how we situate ourselves within that. And yes, I very strongly believe that visibility without reflection flattens culture. So I think it's very important that we think about what the ideas that are sort of framing a particular object. I think that's really at the heart of what I understand as design, or the archive that I've studied of the chairs collected in the museum, is each one was representative of a moment, an idea, a thought, a sensibility, the shift in culture, the shift in production. It spoke of a certain moment. So I think, yes, we very much carry that responsibility in a very good, positive way, because as a 3,000 plus year old culture, we have enough and many stories to dive into. And to think of craft in a single dimension as just craft, ornament, beauty, material excellence, so on and so forth, I think is a little sort of, reducing its, value. The other thing I would like to just add to that is, I think as designers, particularly in a country like India, we have a responsibility towards co-authorship, to bring craftsmen into the narrative, because while we are designing and we are conceptualizing, they are making it, but our making is not divorced from their intelligence. So bringing them into that conversation and perhaps expanding that is critical.
Just wanted to react to something that Gunjan said about the role of crafts, because this is a field, I think, where we as Western design historians can really learn from cultures like design culture in India, because we have been brainwashed by a modern design ideology that pretended that design is mainly about industrial production or mass production. And in the last 20, 30 years, we've learned that actually there has never been, in furniture design especially, never been really an industrial, fully automatized production, but individual craft-driven processes and techniques have always continued to exist, even in Western countries. And now with other cultures, other design perspective entering the global stage, we learn to reassess our own Western design history, and we learn how much crafts can bring to the global design discourse. It's not only a specific design stage where this is relevant, but really for everyone. And we learn that crafts have always existed also in Western design. If you look at certain Scandinavian design evolutions, at people like Hella Jongerius, Josef Frank, even Eileen Gray, a great craftsperson in French Art Deco design. So we also learn to revisit our own Western design history, inspired by countries like India or also China, a bit less, but this is so rewarding at the moment. And it teaches us also a new position to what an object can be, a crafted object, an object that makes a new use of traditional crafts in an innovative, or either conceptually or formally, in a new way, gives us a completely new attachment to an object. It shows it builds a relation with us. And this is what I feel in Gunjan's objects, for example, that some of the industrially thought objects don't give. So I think at the moment, we're learning or rebuilding our relation to the material world of objects. And it shows that there is a big longing for this more intimate relation to the world of objects that has grown over the last decades, where we have been alienated from this industrial world of objects. And I think that's one thing that the current renaissance of crafts in design can really bring to the global stage.
And adding on to that, from an institutional perspective for you, how do you avoid overframing work, especially when you're dealing with cultures like us, like India, which are very rich and layered?
I think we avoid overframing the work because as museum persons, we're very used to also letting the object speak. And there's a material presence of the object, of just being close to the object, being face to face with an object in an exhibition, which no digital or printed image can replace. So working with this aura and the presence of the object in an exhibition, in a collection, I think avoids overframing it by itself, because we know as exhibition makers that we need to give space to the object. Then we also need to give space to a context or to an explanation, but we work very carefully with this information architecture that every exhibition is to not, you put it right, not overframe and not impose our curatorial narrative onto the visitor, because we know that everyone has its own eye, and we want the visitors to feel their own eye and to feel what magic can happen when they experience something that they haven't experienced. And this is really, it's only happening physically in an analog world and not in a digital world.
Okay. And if we talk about what is actually diversifying, if we talk about the current context, this is to both of you, that when we say the global stage is expanding, what do you think is expanding from each of your perspectives?
What is expanding clearly is, not only are we talking about the representation of the global South in a sort of very Western context, we're talking about perhaps the expansion of our understanding of what authorship is. I think omission is an important element, and Mateo touched upon that with the Women in Design exhibition. The minute we bring, it was a very powerful exhibition that spoke about the presence of women in design historically, and how they've pretty much been on the periphery in spite of being equal and major participants in the sort of production of important pieces as we understand it. The practice of Charles and Ray Eames was of great inspiration to me, because, the role of Ray Eames within the practice is significant, but it was not something that was hugely credited. Or even the Panther from the Cartier collection, which was designed by
Jean
Toussaint, was a great revelation. I always associated that particular design with like Cartier, a male voice. To be part of that exhibition for me as a designer was an incredible moment. Firstly, I've been working in global design for 20 years since the beginning of my career. And being in Milan for all those years, blah, 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 I always felt it was impossible to break those barriers. It was male-dominated and it was white. And here I was a woman designer. What's the relevance? I forever tried to understand. That moment was a very empowering one. And I think it was empowering because even for me on a personal level, I felt that I've been doing this in a very committed, determined way in spite of, family commitments, being a mother, being a wife. My own family started to take me seriously after that, because I feel in India, women designers, particularly working in the world of design and craft, are relegated as hobbyists or a garage business, or, oh, she's so talented, amazing. So I think in that context, these exhibitions, these curatorial perspectives have immense power of communicating, some very simple truths of our design histories. So I think that's really, where we are at, more inclusion, deeper narratives will help craft and design in many different ways.
Well, many of the things that are changing have already been mentioned. The recognition of crafts as a very, very important aspect in not only design today, but also in the whole modern history of design. New personalities, new protagonists entering the stage, new aesthetics that are resulting from new materials, new production methods. I would say that what's also changing is, from our perspective as a museum, the way what we consider a museum, a design museum, to be. Today we're no longer seeing the Vitra Design Museum as this building by Frank Gehry, and only what's happening inside that building is what the Vitra Design Museum does. I mean, that's the building by Krishna Doshi. That's such an incredible work of architecture, so I recommend to anyone who travels to Europe to come and see it. And we see this as an extension of our museum's activities. It resulted out of the dialogue with Doshi and excuse me, and his practice and his granddaughter Kushnu Hove, that was initiated by the exhibition, but then it led to a building that's now on the campus. It's an amazing work. So we also think that a museum today is more than an institution that collects and exhibits, but we're also there to launch initiatives, to launch projects, to collaborate with other international museums. That has been facilitated a lot by the opportunity of meeting online. That's only happened through the pandemic. Skype never worked before the pandemic, if you remember. We always tried it, but it never worked. Suddenly it was possible. And now what we can do is we can co-curate exhibitions with museums anywhere in the world. Yesterday I discussed with some museums here in Delhi that we might co-produce exhibitions in the future on topics that we are both interested in. This is great. We can have a curator from our institution with a curator from Delhi, meeting every week if it's necessary, sharing areas of research, areas of collecting, and then doing an exhibition together, something that's shown here in Delhi, but also in our museum. And these are great advancements also, not only in the way how design is produced, but also how it is communicated and brought to a global audience. So that's another thing that's changing. So we see, we also have to say that these are all positive changes. We also see changes that are very challenging at the moment. Political changes, societies being in a status that is very tense and with a lot of conflict. So we would have to say that we need to use these positive changes to deal with the big challenges that we're facing at the moment. But I think the positive is, I think design people are positive spirits per se, because we believe in the power of making, doing something, prototyping something, and not just saying, oh, it's so complicated. I think that's the great advantage that designers and the design world has, maybe compared to other areas of society, that we know how to bring a thought into realization and into making. And I think that's also a very political power. It's not only an artistic strategy, it's something that we see today. It's something that brings us beyond just designing a beautiful object. We know it's a skill of realization that we can apply to a lot of areas in society, and that's why design today is going beyond the object so much, and that's what we also see here in India.
So you'd say the diversification and the changes that are happening are more at a structural level rather than a curatorial level?
No, they are also on a curatorial level, both on a curatorial and structural level, and they are also on a formal level. But I would say, the formal changes are what is the least relevant. The form that a design idea can take has been, if I remember, that I was joining the Vitra Design Museum 30 years ago, and I remember that it was all about form, how the object looked, and whether it was postmodern or modern or colorful, or what's the role of the ornament. I feel that today this is no longer in the focus of the discussion, because we know that what has to be convincing is the idea and how you realize it, and then you get the explanation and the understanding of a certain form. But it's not the primary discussion or the primary curatorial consideration what form it takes, which is not to say that the form is irrelevant. I think it's at the end we're still dealing and we're surrounded with objects, and it's objects that are the waste that we see everywhere. It's objects that we spend money for. So that's relevant. There is a relevance, and I think designers shouldn't lose the connection to the world of objects. But I think we're not recognizing the entire power of design if we stay limited to this world of objects.
Amazing. Coming to almost the last segment of the talk, I'd like to now sort of end this session by talking about where do you think this is leading in future? And my question to you, Gunjan, is that what kind of global design culture do you think or you'd like for the next generation of designers to inherit?
I think a more porous one. We've just spoken about it, so it's all, very exciting going forward. A culture where Indian design does not really has to fight for inclusion. It already has sort of presence, relevance. I also, within the sort of international stage, I also think it is time for Indian design to become unapologetically Indian. I think we, for a very long time, looked at ourselves from a very Western lens. We light our objects in a certain way so that it looks either Japanese or European or, many examples. I think it's time that we actually look at ourselves and our design intelligence and put our works out there in a sort of unapologetic way, telling the stories that are inherent to us, opening the dialogue in a more sort of, proactive way with institutions, with curators, with experts. We just have to put ourselves out there. I think, definitely think the time has come.
And Mateo, how do you see the global design discourse evolving over the next decade now?
The topic of sustainability and responsibility will be absolutely crucial. We're seeing it everywhere in the world, how design has also been part of the problem that we have. It's not only part of the solution. And designers need to respond to that and take this into consideration. On the other hand, I think that a global perspective on design will become absolutely natural. I think we're now in a phase where we're just transgressing from still considering this global exchange as something new towards considering it as something just natural. Just like the digital culture is being considered as something totally normal to a new generation that has grown up with it. And I think the current growing generation is growing up with designers from all over the world mixing. I've just had the pleasure to visit the Design Village school this morning that is now bringing a branch from Delhi to Italy. So it's not a one-way street, The dialogue is happening in both ways, and that's when it becomes natural. And no longer, we Europeans discover something in India. This time is over. And I think it's really a completely normal exchange, students going from Europe to here, from here to Europe, and anywhere in the world. And so we want to contribute to making this more natural and just a given reality for a future generation of designers. And last not least, as I said, it's about sustainability and responsibility. I think it's also working with what's there already. I think the world doesn't need so many more products. I think it needs ideas of how we deal with what's there. I say this with relation to our campus also, because for us the phase where we build big new buildings, factories, showrooms, this is over. We don't need big new buildings. At the moment, what we're doing is focusing on the landscape, on nature, on unsealing surfaces of concrete and giving them back to nature, rather planting plants than building buildings. And so we see the campus as a little model of what might be relevant to the world outside of the campus. The campus is what we can conceive and steer, and we hope to, bring people to the campus that might take away ideas for what they can do in their own realm. And the campus is also reflecting this natural globalization that I just talked about with the Doshi building. We have 2 years ago, we brought a little structure by the Bangladeshi architect Marina Tabassum to the campus. Okay, these are not the big buildings because, as I said, we don't need them at the moment. But this also makes it lighter and more natural and more dialogue-oriented. It's and more open for experimentation. And again, that's what we try to contribute to the design scene. And I think the dialogue has become extremely easy today through not only traveling but also online media. So that's, for us as curators, that's like entering a new world and a new realm of possibilities to collaborate.
Thank you so much. I think we're closing on a very, very encouraging note. I think I'm feeling very encouraged that listening to Gunjan, the way she thinks about where the practices are leading and how designers should be thinking, and she herself, her practice sort of represents that. And listening to your views and understanding that global institutes important institutions like Vitra, how they are thinking of shifting the centers which just resided in certain parts of the world to making it more inclusive for everyone.
Can we have a big round of applause?